So, dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, Fred and I are thrilled to welcome Professor John Keane, who will share his reflections on post-truth with us today. John Keane is Professor of Politics at the University of Sydney and holds a research professorship Theory, History, and Future of Democracy here at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center since 2008. So congratulations of being here for almost a decade now. He is the author of The Life and Death of Democracy and When Trees Fall, Monkeys Scatter, Rethinking Democracy in China, which was published last year. John Keane is part of the Sydney Post-Truth Initiative, which examines fake news, alternative facts, lies, and propaganda with the aim to understand them and to advise on how the truth might survive in this climate. And he's the director and co-founder of the Sydney Democracy Network, which represents people and organizations who are concerned about the dangerous challenges facing democracy today. These challenges concerned us here at the WZB as well. Since December 2016, we have met with employees of the Institute in our Political Challenges discussion group. In the group, we discussed whether the political shifts we have seen over the recent month pose challenges to the social sciences in general, but also the WZB in particular. Some of you might see open societies threatened by populists. We have seen political groups gaining support, which put forward positions that, at least in some part, are not only not based on good or sound arguments, but that also fail to relate to facts. So in today's lecture, we want to talk about the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about post-truth.
Post-truth was also one of the key issues that we discussed in our political challenges meetings over the last year. Just like many fellow citizens, members of the WZB have been concerned about political movements that not just question deeply held political beliefs, but also more factual aspects, like the existence of climate change, things that, on the basis of expertise generated through scientific research, we hold to be true. As a result, many people felt the urge to react. They flocked to the streets all over the world to stand up for science and truth, holding up posters saying truth exists. If John Keane had been at the meetings of our discussion group, he would probably have been critical of this reaction and the flight to truth. John Keane calls himself not a champion of truth, and although he is certainly not a fan of Trump politics, he believes that there might be something positive to the current political developments as they question the role that truth plays in politics. Today's event is part of our new WZB series Achtung, Demokratie, which is one of the results of our discussion group. We would like to thank the Information and Communications Department for organizing this lecture. The next event within the Achtung, Demokratie series will be a film screening of Dieter Rucht's new documentary on the March for Science in Washington, D.C. The film with the title Stand Up for Science will be screened here at the WZB on Tuesday, January 23rd, so do come along. Before we hand over to John, we would like to welcome Silvia Höhne, who is a staff member of the WZB Research Information Unit and a qualified announcer. Silvia is going to read some of the peculiar fake news, false claims, and disinformation that are circulating on the internet in order to guide us into the post-truth world. Thank you.
Dandelion roots, Löwenzahnwurzeln, can boost your immune system and cure cancer. Impfen löst bei Kindern Autismus aus. Flüchtlinge schänden Gräber. Flüchtlinge fangen Schwäne und braten sie. Lukas Podolski schmuggelt Flüchtlinge via Jetski übers Mittelmeer. Margot Käßmann bezeichnet Bundesbürger mit 2 deutschen Eltern und 4 deutschen Großeltern als Nazis. Hillary Clinton betreibt einen Kinderpornoring im Keller einer Pizzeria. Die 13-jährige Deutsch-Russin Lisa wurde in Berlin entführt, von 3 Unbekannten 30 Stunden lang gefangen gehalten und mehrfach vergewaltigt. There's no freedom of speech in Germany. German authorities repress their citizens if they carry out any public protests against immigrants who have committed crimes against European. The Germans destroyed Russian history as they exchanged Russian Tsar Peter the Great for a different person in the late 7th century. The German government is supporting Neonazism in Ukraine. Dänemark eröffnet Bordelle für Zoophile. New York restaurants served a special burger to celebrate the Russian president's birthday. There's no climate change. The more environmental regulations you have, the fewer jobs. The economy always does better under a Republican president. Welfare rolls up, and people on welfare don't work. Black women have a lot more children than white women. A strike warning. Government preps underground bases.
So, schönen guten Wintersabend, meine Damen und Herren. I have to say that I possibly have a new kind of Grippe, which could be called postfaktisch Grippe, which I've had for a number of days here in Berlin, and I'm sorry if I'm a little bit slow-witted tonight. I wanted to say herzlichen Dank to Ellen and Fred for this wonderful Achtung, Demokratie series, also to Sylvia for her fine and disturbing reading, and a special thanks to Kerstin Schneider, who made possible this event tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, my subject is post-truth, postfaktisch. You know that in the heartlands of the old democracies in the Atlantic region and elsewhere, talk of post-truth is flourishing. It was in 2016 the Oxford English Dictionary Word of the Year, and it has become the word of the year in other languages, in Spanish, in German, and in China there is a considerable discussion that is going on about this very subject. Some observers, you know, speak of a new post-truth era. They warn of the poisoning of our public life by post-truth. Some speak of the emergence of a new kind of authoritarianism. Some call for resistance, and growing numbers call for resistance to post-truth, using the weapons of facts and objectivity and truth. What I want to do in this lecture tonight, as briefly as I can, is to sketch, based on a book that I'm working on, based on a research project that we have in Sydney, I want to sketch to you 5 themes that seem to me to be of special importance in trying to make sense of this post-factish phenomenon. It is an approach that combines history and concepts, that pays attention to empirical developments, including media developments, that pays attention to norms, and I want to say something about democracy as well. These 5 points are the following. I want to say something more about the key term, postfaktisch. It's a strangely fuzzy term, and given that the term itself warns against the confusion in public life, it's a paradox, to say the least, that the term is not very well defined. So I want to say something more about the term. Secondly, I want to introduce to you the unfamiliar term, but a term that you will find in psychoanalysis and in other forms of psychology, gaslighting. As far as I know, there is no verb in German, Gaslicht. I'm not sure if there's Gaslichten, but gaslighting, I want to say something about gaslighting. Thirdly, I want to address the bigger question of what is new about this post-truth phenomenon. Fourth, and more controversially, I want to ask the question which Gianni Fattimo and others have asked, and Richard Rorty certainly would have asked if he was still with us, of whether this post-truth phenomenon is part of a much bigger historical shift, a kind of farewell to truth, as Fattimo puts it. And I want to raise this question by sketching the outlines of what I could call a new geography and history of truth. And finally, I want to say a few words about democracy, post-truth, and truth. And I want to suggest that it is possible to actually resist post-truth and also to be suspicious at the same time of truth. That is, I want to introduce the idea that a democracy, a healthy democracy, is one in which there is a plurality of lived interpretations, Bedeutungen, of life, so that democracy is understood as a guardian against what Daniel Kahneman has called the illusions of certainty. This is quite a lot, and I will try to be as brief as I can, beginning with the question of how to define post-truth. You will have noticed in media and in some of the more scholarly literature that there is a constant reference to the Oxford English Dictionary, which defines post-truth as a type of public communication which sets aside objective facts and instead appeals to emotion and personal belief. This is the meaning that Angela Merkel on September the 19th in her post-election speech invoked. Es heißt ja neuerdings, wir lebten in postfaktischen Zeiten, she said. Das soll wohl heißen, die Menschen interessieren sich nicht mehr für Fakten, sondern folgen allein den Gefühlen. This idea that post-truth is all about the obliteration of objectivity, of facts on the one side, and a celebration of feelings on the other, is quite widespread in the literature. I don't like it very much, I have to say, because as a long-time media scholar, I have been interested in the last several years in the logic, so to say, of this style of public communication which is being called post-truth. I want to suggest that post-truth actually is more complicated as a type of discourse. It has recombinant qualities. There are at least four components that make up this phenomenon of post-truth, beginning with the most obvious, which is Lügen, lying. Old-fashioned lying is intrinsic to the phenomenon of post-truth. Liars are those who say things willfully that they know in their mind's eye is not the case. They try to perform a kind of alchemy. They say things willfully that they know in their minds not to be true, as, for example, Donald Trump does. There are now measurements of his lying, at least 3 lies a day from Donald Trump. Part of a strategy, we could say, in his business, he already in the 1990s became too big to fail in the real estate business. He's now too big to fact check because he tells so many of them that it's impossible to keep up with them. So you will find that there is no drought. There never was a drought in California, that at the beginning of his inauguration, coronation might be the better word, the weather cleared when actually light rain fell, as we know, throughout his address, that he employs more workers in New Jersey than almost anybody, and that his Trump winery is the largest winery on the East Coast. These are all lies. Then there is, secondly, a second component of post-truth is what, and I am not swearing here, I assure you, I am using the technical term of Harry Frankfurt, the American philosopher, bullshit, Schwachsinn. Bullshit is a component element of post-truth. It's hot air talk. I like to say that it's excrement without nutrient. It's a kind of speech whose functional effect is to set aside all questions of veracity. The bullshitter doesn't want you to ask whether he or she is telling the truth. They want to persuade you that they're good people, that what they have to say is interesting, and so on. And this kind of Schwachsinn is a very important element for post-truth. And then thirdly, there is, I think, I've noticed in the language of post-truth, a kind of symbolic buffoonery, a kind of Clownspielen, or maybe Hanswurstspielen, a kind of bric-a-brac, a kind of potpourri of different elements that together make the whole phenomenon of post-truth a kind of confusing mix. There are nonsense moments, there are jokes, and there is a lot of boasting. You may know that Victor Klemperer, who was one of the great analysts of the language of the Dritte Reich, devoted quite a lot of work to what he called the curse of the superlative. And you will find plenty of this, and I want to just, if you can bear it, just a minute.
Nobody can do it like me. Nobody. Nobody can do it like me.
Loud enough?
Nobody's stronger than me.
Nobody has better toys than I do.
There's nobody bigger or better at the military than I am.
Nobody loves the Bible more than I do. Nobody builds walls better than me. Nobody's better to people with disabilities than me. Nobody's fighting for the veterans like I'm fighting for the veterans.
There's nobody that's done so much for equality as I have.
There's nobody more pro-Israel than I am. There's nobody more conservative than me.
There is nobody that respects women more than I do. Nobody would be tougher on ISIS than Donald Trump.
Nobody's ever had crowds like Trump has had.
There's nobody that understands the horror of nuclear better than me. And nobody even understands it but me. It's called devaluation, the sale of the uranium, that nobody knows what it means. I know what it means.
Nobody knows more about trade than me.
Nobody knows the game better than I do.
Nobody's in the history of this country has ever known so much about infrastructure as Donald Trump. I know the H-1B. I know the H-2B. Nobody knows it better than me.
Nobody knows politicians better than I do.
Nobody knows more about taxes than I do. Nobody knows more about debt than I do.
Nobody knows the system better than me, which is why I alone can fix it.
In this third element of post-truth, there are other components. Willful exaggerations, as when Marine Le Pen describes the EU as a huge prison. Or we are experiencing, she has famously said more than once, the end of one world and the birth of another, the return of nation states. There is plenty of rough speech, which reminds us that in the history of democracy, rough speech was often the norm. There's plenty of grotesque moments, as, for example, when Geert Wilders, who is a specialist at causing trouble, dubs mosques as palaces of hatred and Moroccan youth as street terrorists. Disturbingly, the champions of post-truth constantly refer to truth. And by truth, they usually mean what they say is true, and what everybody else says is, of course, fake. That's the meaning of fake news, a phrase which they have invented. There is plenty of plain bad taste. Haiti immigrants all have AIDS, the president of the United States was recently reported as saying. And there are those grotesque moments that happen as when Trump entered the Houston Astrodome after a catastrophic hurricane, crammed with tens of thousands of people, homeless, seeking shelter in that Astrodome. And his opening line to these people was, "Thanks for showing up. Thanks for showing up." I mean, what kind of remark is this? There's a lot of hair splitting, there is a lot of setting things aside, and the master, you may know of this, is Zoltan Kovac, who is Viktor Orban government's spokesman, who, when pressed, for example, about the possibility that vigilante citizens patrols are manning and operating the borders of Hungary, he simply says, what you are trying to portray here is non-existent. These are literally his words. It's a gross simplification. Next question, and that's that. Then there is a fourth element to post-truth. So we have lying, we have bullshit, we have this clowning, this buffoonery, but we also have Schweigen. We have silence. One thing that is, I think, important to really understand about this post-truth phenomenon is that silence, it produces patterns of silence. Silence is not, as Ortega famously put it, silence is not what is left over after people have been speaking. Communication comes wrapped in silence. It codes silence. So that when you are watching the performances of the post-truth, the merchants of post-truth, pay attention to the way in which they are silent about all kinds of matters. For example, the militarization of the police in the United States, or the way, for instance, that Trump doesn't speak about there being 48 ambassadorships currently not filled in the United States, including no current American ambassador in South Korea, which is a very strange phenomenon. And he doesn't speak about the running down of Foggy Bottom, the destruction of all kinds of other institutions. These are not his topics. And here there is an important point, which is that journalists who hang on every one of his tweets are in effect functioning as puppy dogs, poodles of post-truth, because it's exactly the kind of performance that the merchants of post-truth want journalists to pay attention to. So this is roughly a working definition of some ideal-typish definition of what post-truth might come for us to discuss, and what I think it means. The second and larger point I want to point out is I want to say something about gaslighting. Of course, post-truth is a performance. It has a vaudeville quality to it. You know, in the 1920s and 30s, vaudeville was before the age of television and cinema. It was a type of public performance where there were clowns and singers and dancers and drummers and minstrels and acrobats and comedians and circus animals. Well, something like this goes on in post-truth performances. This is not, I emphasize, what Daniel Boorstin famously called the art of contrivance. It's not simply the dictatorship of illusion, as Guy Debord famously put it. There are political effects of this post-truth performance style, and one of the most sinister and disturbing, it seems to me, is this phenomenon of gaslighting. Now, you may not have seen this film by George Cukor. It's a film, interestingly, made during World War II. It's a film in which Ingrid Bergman won an Academy Award, an Oscar for this, for her performance in this film. It's a film about a woman who falls in love with a gangster. She doesn't know he's a gangster. And what he does, very cleverly, is reduces her to nothingness. And he does this by manipulating situations. You know, they're at the opera, and he sees that his watch is missing, and he makes this very clear to her, then opens her bag and finds the watch inside it and gives her a very sinister look. The title of the film comes from her complaint that the gaslighting in the house in which they live seems to go up and down in a kind of irregular way. And he says, darling, you're imagining things, when in fact he is manipulating the gaslight. Gaslighting has become a term in psychoanalysis and in other areas of communication to describe a strategy for disorientating and destabilizing people. for sowing the seeds of self-doubt, for ruining their capacity to make sense of the world, to make judgments about how they should live. It's a kind of cognitive overload strategy. And here I agree very much with Judith Butler, the American feminist linguist and political thinker, who points out if you analyze the logic of Trump's tweets, not only do you see that hardly any of them are full sentences, and there are almost no paragraphs, the really important point is that you actually cannot easily make sense of the phenomenon because you never know which bits are executive decrees, where he's ordering something and announcing it on a tweet, or whether they are statements of intention, or whether they're just simple acts of provocation, or whether they're trial balloons, or whether they are all of these at the same time. The point is, her suggestion is that do not think of post-truth as a product of erratic personality disorder people like Trump. Don't think of it in this way. Think of it actually as a calculated strategy for sowing the seeds of confusion and disorientation. I want to just play this very short video of a press conference in the early Trump administration where you will see this strategy of gaslighting going on. He's trying to gaslight the journalists. If you ponder this, you will see that actually nothing happens in the press conference. He starts with the BBC reporter, who you will see he's rather rude too. But just pay attention to this for just a minute. Oh, please, come back. Oh, why not? Okay, so... yeah, it doesn't want to play. How come? No.
Wait.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it's so gaslit that it doesn't work. Oh. I don't know. Maybe I do.
Wait. Quiet.
There's been a report out that 48 bomb threats have been made against Jewish centers all across the country in the last couple of weeks. There are people who are committing anti-Semitic acts or threatening to...
You see, he said he was going to ask a very simple, easy question. And it's not. It's not a simple question, not a fair question. Okay, sit down. I understand the rest of your question. So here's the story, folks. Number one, I am the least anti-Semitic person that you've ever seen in your entire life. Number two, racism, the least racist person. In fact, we did very well relative to other people running as a Republican. Quiet. See, he lied about, he was going to get up and ask a very straight, simple question. So, it's welcome to the world of the media.
Would you accept that that was a good example of the smooth running of government?
Yeah, I do. Let me tell you about the
Were there any mistakes in that?
Wait. I know who you are. Just wait.
I guess my question is, why should Americans trust you when you accuse the information they receive of being fake when you're providing information?
Well, I don't know. I was given that information. I've seen that information around. But it was a very substantial victory. Do you agree with that? How much longer should we stay here, folks? Wait, let's see. I want to find a friendly reporter.
You said that the leaks are real, but the news is fake. I guess I don't understand. It seems that there's a disconnect there. If the information coming from those leaks is real, then how can the stories be fake?
No, the reporting is fake.
And if I
look,
may ask,
look.
I just want to ask
Jim, you know what it is? Here's the thing. The public isn't, they read newspapers, they see television, they watch. They don't know if it's true or false.
Why not just say it's a story I don't like?
I do that.
Call it fake news,
no, I do
you're
that.
undermining confidence in our news media.
Here's the thing.
Isn't
okay,
that important?
I understand what and you're right about that, except this. See, I know when I should get good and when I should get bad. And sometimes I'll say, wow, that's going to be a great story, and I'll get killed. I know what's good and bad. I'd be a pretty good reporter, not as good as you.
Are you going to include the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional
Hispanic
Hispanic
Caucus?
Caucus?
I tell you what, do you want to set up the meeting? Do you want to set up the meeting?
No.
Are they friends of
I'm
yours?
just a reporter.
No, set up the meeting.
I know some of them, but I'm sure
Let's
they're
go set up
right
a
now.
meeting. I would love to meet with the Black Caucus. I think it's great, the Congressional Black Caucus. I think it's great.
you can be forgiven for not understanding that press conference, that clip of the press conference, and that's the point that I'm trying to make, that one of the elements, the important logic of gaslighting, is the seeds of confusion that are sown through the structure of the discourse itself. One of the masters of this is not just an Atlantic phenomenon, is Ernesto Abella, who until quite recently was the press spokesman for Duterte. And Abella was a master of gaslighting. Effectively, he would say something like, you know, the president says many things. You know, I'm going to wipe out the drug trade. If necessary, I will kill. Yes, I lie. And Abella described himself repeatedly as someone who completes the sentences, as he put it, of Duterte. And when he completed completed the sentences of the president, the sentences themselves are simply not intelligible. And that is the point, that there is a kind of unintelligibility that is structured into this post-truth phenomenon, and it's what I want to call gaslighting. Of course, the question of whether people absorb gaslighting, whether they swallow this gaslighting, is another question which we ought to discuss. Third point, I want to say something briefly about the question of the historical novelties of post-truth. There is more than a touch hysteria among journalists and some scholars and scientists and others. I'm thinking of Jonathan Foley, who is one of the top global environmental scientists in the United States, who says that the spread of post-truth in the American polity is actually threatening the leading global moral role of the United States. That kind of language is more than common, one can say, and there is a sense, often put, of an ending, of something new being born. I'm struck by the Anglo-centric bias of quite a lot of the discussion. If you don't have to talk to Russians, or you don't have to go to China to see that on a daily basis, Russian and Chinese citizens put up with post-truth on a much larger scale than we do. There is also, I think, a problem of amnesia in the whole discussion, and that's why I want to say something about the probable historical novelties of this post-truth phenomenon. Some things, of course, are familiar. Lying is a very old art in politics. Think of Plato's noble lie, think of Machiavelli's recommendation that a successful prince must be a great pretender and a dissembler. Or think, more recently, of Harry Truman's description of Richard Nixon, who was a political figure in my early years as a student. Harry Truman once described him as, quote, a no-good lying bastard. He can lie out of both sides of his mouth at the same time. And if he ever caught himself telling the truth, he'd lie just to keep his hand in. This was Truman's description of Richard Nixon, indicted under Watergate, of course. And you will know that there is a tendency for this show business, glitz style of performance of post-truth, that this is part of a much older shift that has been taking place in most democracies, where politics comes to have the qualities of show business, of glitz. So some things are not new, and yet it does seem to me that one important way of judging the novelties of this post-truth is to pay attention to this unfinished communications revolution that has been going on since roughly the 1960s. It's a communications revolution, as we all know, in which text, sound, and image are combined as never before, in which there is the networked flow of information packets globally, where entry into the system is possible from multiple points, and so on. There is, I think, no doubt that this communications revolution is a driver of the spread of post-truth. Think of photoshopped materials and mashups. Trump's very first campaign advertisement showed migrants allegedly crossing the Mexican border. In fact, it was a mashup. It was an image of migrants crossing from Morocco in North Africa. There are imposter news sites that use fake URLs. There are fantasy news sites like WTOE5 News, which created the story that Pope Francis shocks the world by endorsing Trump for president. There are shareable, made-up news platforms, Macedonian teenagers making money, Christian fundamentalists peddling the spirit. There are meme launch pads. There are parody accounts like The Onion, which claims to be America's finest news source. And there are lots of devoted fanzine platforms. All of these are part of the ecology of this unfinished communications revolution. And it is, I think, the driver of several novelties of this post-truth phenomenon. And the novelties I see are these, that first of all, this is the first time that this kind of post-truth discourse develops global legs. It goes global. It is also, and this is a second novelty, it's that this post-truth discourse penetrates very deeply into our daily lives. If you read George Orwell's 1984, or if you ponder Václav Havel's Living in the Truth, you will know that there was always a typewriter that could be placed in a secret place, separate from cameras and surveillance. This becomes very difficult in the age of the Internet of Things, so that the spread of post-truth discourse spreads into the most intimate spheres of daily life. It's very difficult to disentangle oneself from this post-truth. There's another novelty, I think, that should not be underestimated about this present period of post-truth, and it is the resurgence, the return of populism. This is a big discussion on which I have been working for the last several years, and I know there has been much discussion here at the Wissenschaftszentrum. But this is to say that the eruption of populism, the emergence of leaders and parties, AfD included, who are against the establishment, who draw support from the disaffected, from people's middle-class, precariat populations and others, who draw upon people who are disaffected, pissed off with things. It is this phenomenon of populism that seems to be the main carrier, the main agent, the Träger of post-truth phenomenon. So I'm speaking about Viktor Orban and Norbert Hofer and Erdogan. They are the merchants of post-truth. They're the exploiters of trust and confidence artists who sell hope mixed with lies and bullshit and buffoonery and silence. And this raises the question of why it is that supporters go for this. How come this populism is attractive to millions of people? Is it because of the inherited fascism in all of us, as Michel Foucault famously said? Is it that people naturally crave leaders? I do not think so. But I do think it's important to understand that one of the disturbing things about this populism is that it raises expectations of betterment of peoples. That is, it instrumentalizes the hope principle. It has a certain pseudo-democratic quality. There are lots of destructive effects of populism in action, as we see going on in the United States and as we see under the phenomenon of Brexit. Demagogic leadership, attacks on independent media, the judiciary, and other power monitoring institutions. All this is clear, but one thing is that this populism is the agent. It's the pusher of this phenomenon of post-truth. Fourth, I want to say something in support of a much bigger project that in Sydney we call a new geography and history of truth. It can't be done, of course, but it would be worth trying. That is to think about the spatial and temporal variations of the understanding of truth. Why suggest this? Because it's obvious, to me at least, that for the moment, the most orthodox, the most commonplace reaction to post-truth that you can find among journalists, and you can find among some scholars and plenty of politicians and more than a few citizens, is the rush towards facts, towards objectivity. The argument is that we need to recover factual thinking. We need to have propositions that are based on evidence, that are true because they correspond. They are statements that are true because they correspond to the facts. This rather raises the question of what exactly truth is. And here's a warning, a health warning, because Wittgenstein is coming. You know, you don't have to be a philosopher to see that this understanding of truth as effectively about facts, that truth is saying things or depicting things that correspond to reality. You don't have to be a philosopher to see that there are some serious philosophical and I would say also political objections to this way of thinking. It's as if we will be rescued from the evils, the poisons of post-truth by getting back to reality, by embracing a kind of adequation model, a correspondence understanding of truth, a kind of version of the Alfred Tarski principle, who once famously put it in terms of the proposition that snow is white. P is true and only true if snow is white. P is true if and only if P. Or think of John Searle's argument that reality, there is such a thing as brute facts, and that these are not affected by interpretations and by language. You will find this way of thinking against post-truth in Al Gore's new film on hope and truth. It's a very inspiring film, but it's premised upon the belief that that Al Gore is the truth teller. He tells you exactly the way the world is, and he wants to persuade you of the factuality of what he has to say. Now, because I'm, so to say, on firm home soil here in Germany, the land of Nietzsche, I think it's fair, and Max Weber, I can say that there are some serious objections to this rather simplistic understanding of reality, of truth as correspondence to reality. Think of Max Weber's reflections upon Sachlichkeit. Max Weber was not the only one who insisted that in the human sciences, descriptions of so-called reality are themselves structured by language, by concepts. This is the neo-Kantianism in the work of Max Weber. And as Max Weber said more than once, if you don't accept the perspectives that I'm using, the concepts that I'm using to redescribe the reality, then I cannot persuade you of their veracity. But we need these concepts. We need interpretations because reality is actually infinite. And we would literally go mad if we did not have frameworks to make sense of that reality. Well, this is the kind of dynamic at work in the famous duck-rabbit puzzle of Wittgenstein. Is this a duck or is this a rabbit? It depends, as Wittgenstein pointed out, on the linguistic perspective, the language game through which one observes this object as a duck or rabbit. This introduces, I think, the possibility that we need to think more broadly, and that this post-truth phenomenon actually gives us the cue to think more boldly and broadly about the geography and history of truth. A few words about the geography of truth. You know, it was the French Renaissance writer Montaigne who famously said that truth on one side of the Pyrenees is falsehood on the other. Think of the way that we like to refer to cities as laboratories of knowledge. You know, the Copenhagen School of International Relations or the Chicago School of Economics are examples. Or think about those cultures that actually don't have words for truth. The Pitjantjatjara peoples of my South Australia have a family of terms that roughly translate as a true story. But what is interesting is that the Pitjantjatjara peoples, when they make a statement about something, you know, there is a tree, they always tack on a question mark at the end of this sentence. That is, the statement that something is so is an appeal to the agreement, to the consent of the other. It's as if they recognize what white society usually forgets, that truth and trust are twins. I have been in China recently and have had some deep discussions about the history of understandings of truth in the Chinese context, and I would love to talk to you about that in more detail, but one of the things that I think is very striking in the Chinese discussion is that in Chinese there are many more terms to describe truth than we have in European languages, and there is, in other words, a strong sense that truth has many faces. And this does raise the question of whether some cultures are more truth-obsessed than others. This I cannot talk about yet. Perhaps we can in discussion. I want to say something as well about the history of truth. If we take our European tradition, have a look at the following list, rather randomly selected, I would say conflicting understandings of what counts as truth. The Greek understanding of truth as aletheia, an understanding of truth that Heidegger sought to resurrect. It's a strange word to describe a process of disclosure or unconcealing of things. This is what truth is. Or think of Christian understandings. John chapter 14, verse 6, speaking about the way and the truth and the life. If we had been here 100 years ago in this room, no doubt that understanding of truth would have been very, very strong indeed. Think about Luther's explosive attack on the church, calling into question their so-called monopoly of truth. Think of the expression of Lessing, much loved by Hannah Arendt, that God has actually concealed from us the truth, and that means that each person has room in which to decide for themselves what truth is. Think of Nietzsche's famous sentence, "There are no facts, only interpretations," and this too is an interpretation. And think of Wittgenstein's insistence in Über Gewissheit, his last text, where he points out that knowledge, as he puts it, is always based upon acknowledgement, Anerkennung, and so on. All of this raises, I think, the question of why the current rush towards facticity, to objectivity, to the facts, is so cocksure of itself. And it raises the much bigger question, I think, about whether it's possible to live beyond that understanding, rather narrow understanding of truth that's being proposed, and to come to terms with this much more complex geography and history of truth. And I want to finish, finally, by saying a few words about democracy and truth. You know that there has been, in the history of democracy, vigorous arguments about the importance of truth, and it is still something of a mantra. It's something of an axiom among journalists. Look at the New York Times full-page ads, where the New York Times claims that it is the champion of truth, and that championing of truth is a basic pillar of American democracy. Well, at the University of Sydney, we currently have advertising for the university that talks about unlearning truth. And this might surprise you, but it's my cue to ask the question of whether actually it's possible that a democracy requires actually some doubts about truth, at least in the sense that it's currently talked about. And I want to finish by basically talking about three ways of unpacking this question, of answering this question of whether we can unlearn truth, beginning descriptively. The question really is an empirical question of whether the period that we're living through is part of a much older process and a deeper process, reinforced by this communications revolution, for the proliferation of many different platforms, many different perspectives on the world, to the point where the plasticity of reality, the sense that our truth has many faces, that the world is a complex world, actually grows. You know, I think that we are living in times where tropes like "we hold these truths to be self-evident" arouse public suspicions. That kind of language of the American Revolution today is more doubtful. There is a kind of messiness, empirically speaking, that is unfolding. There is a kind of pluralization of people's lived perceptions of the world. It's true that we still speak about the truth. This was a point that Heidegger, in his whole concept of Verwindung, emphasized, and Gianni Fatima has pointed out that we still are attached to talk of the truth in the same way that we still say, "Lord, help us," or we still say, you know, the sun is setting, even though Copernicus taught us that actually it's not the sun that is setting, but it's actually the earth which is spinning away from the sun. So truth lingers, but its grip, its theological grip on us is greatly weakened, or so I would suggest. And this, I think, is part of the emergence of what I call monitory democracy. Many platforms that contest power, that seek to humble power through watchdog and barking dog and guide dog institutions. These platforms introduce a measure of uncertainty and doubt and skepticism and irony in actually existing democracies, to the point where one could say that one of the principles of Wittgenstein, who recommended in Übergewissheit, that instead of hereon saying, "I know this," we should always be required to say, "I believe I know." We should be more modest in what we claim we know. Well, I think this is an empirical question, and I'd very much like to hear what you have to say. And almost finally, the question strategically is whether post-truth can be dealt with in other ways. That is, can it be combated? Can there be an undoing of its poisonous effects, of the gaslighting effects that I've been talking about? I think this is an interesting and important question. For the moment, many of the solutions are technical. For example, Facebook is currently testing in its hugely popular news feed. It has well over 2 billion followers. It's in 5 or 6 countries. It's actually separating out professional news sites, as it calls them, from which it calls the Explore section of Facebook, from family and friends content. And the early evidence, this is an attempt to try to stem the tide of fake news, of post-truth, but the early evidence is that in fact this is working in favor of fake news, because people are not going to the New York Times, they're not going to Die Zeit, they are not going to La Repubblica, they are not going to The Guardian, they are going to family and friends sites, and this actually works in favor of the spread of post-truth. So for the moment, there are lots of technical lots of technical proposed solutions, but the question is whether there are other methods and equally powerful methods of overcoming post-truth. I have in mind, I want to mention just a few examples, and I'm about to stop. Think of the Dutch initiative, De Correspondent. It's a very interesting platform that does not do breaking news. The whole idea is, its editor, by the way, is a Nietzschean, who says that truth is a lie. And the whole idea is to develop investigative journalism that is about social and political matters, that introduces audiences to more slow journalism. It doesn't do breaking news because it thinks breaking news is actually destructive of the ethics of democracy. Or think of techniques for dealing with post-truth that the French situationists in the 1960s called détournement. I'm not sure if you're aware, but in the last 48 hours, someone projected onto Trump's hotel in Washington, D.C., the word shithole. I mean, it's just as effective, arguably, as all the appeal to objectivity and facts. I do think that the old Greek Democrat principle of parrhesia deserves revival. Parrhesia is frank, bold speech that says things bluntly, and it says things emotionally, but that can have disruptive effects on post-truth. I do think the role of expertise is crucially important, and that's another lecture for another time. It's the subject of the next Achtung, Demokratie film. And I also think that law courts are important spaces for contesting post-truth. Not to be forgotten is parody and joke-telling and satire. And I don't know if you've already spotted this, but one of the things that Trump does not like is jokes. He does not like jokes at his expense, and that is an opportunity for those who are opposed to the style of communication that I'm calling here post-truth. Finally, I think Hannah Arendt had a point. She was in two minds about the subject of Wahrheit, but prompted by the Watergate scandal, one of the points that Hannah Arendt consistently mentioned was that truth has a despotic quality, and that a republican democracy must learn to live without truth, because the problem of truth is something like the problem of veritatis terror. Think of Jan Hus, think of Giordano Bruno, think of the long history of people who were sacrificed in the name of truth. I think the point that Hannah Arendt wanted to make is that, in fact, truth has a pompous quality. By saying that's true, that, so to say, brings to an end the discussion about things. Whereas what a democracy needs, as I have tried to write over the years, is a plurality of lived interpretations of life, an awareness that it's possible to see the world in at least two different ways, to come to terms with others who don't see things as we do. This is one of the basic elements of a democracy. Democracy, in practice, when it's healthy, is a living reminder that truths are never self-evident, and that what counts as truth is a matter of interpretation. Well, I could go on and on and on, but I wanted to say that in this sense, democracy stands for a world beyond truth, and it's certainly against post-truth. To be a Democrat is to resist both, not because all women and men are created equal or are equally reasonable, but rather because democracy supposes that no man or woman is good enough to claim that they know the truth with a capital T and to rule permanently over their fellows and the earthly habitats in which they dwell. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's probably enough on the subject of post-truth. Herzlichen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.